Good evening. It's Grant Cameron from the Cameron Files, and I have two guests with me tonight. One is actually my co-host, Victor Vigiani, who runs Z-Line Communications in Toronto. He's an independent news. It's a new independent news service dedicated to the compilation, distribution, and analysis of news and intelligence related to the national security and geopolitical implications of the disclosure of the extraterrestrial presence now engaging the human race. Victor's research and analysis of anomalous aerial phenomena spans over 30 years. His experience involves UFO sightings, report investigation, counseling work with individuals reporting anomalous experiences, presentations, and journalism in the field of ET disclosure issues. Good evening, Victor.
Hello, Grant, and it's just terrific to be with you. It's a very special day for us.
Yes.
For us both.
I'm very honored because my main guest tonight is Paul Hellyer, who is one, according to his own website, this is the way he describes it, Paul Hellyer is one of Canada's best known and most controversial politicians. First elected in 1949, that was long before I was even born. He was the youngest cabinet minister appointed to Louis Saint Laurent's government 8 years later. He subsequently held senior posts in the government of Lester B. Pearson and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who defeated him for the Liberal Party leadership in 1968. The following year, after achieving the rank of senior minister, which was later designated Deputy Prime Minister, Hellyer resigned from the Trudeau cabinet on a question of principle relating to housing. Although Hellyer is best known for unification of the Canadian Armed Forces and for his 1968 chairmanship of the Task Force on Housing and Urban Development, he maintained a lifelong interest in macroeconomics. Through the years, as a journalist and political commentator, he has continued to fight for economic reforms and has written several books on the subject. And of interest to Victor and myself, Paul later on in his life became very involved in the UFO subject, which is what we want to talk to him today about a little bit, and also his new book, which we hope Paul will begin to talk about, and it's called Hope Restored, an autobiography by Paul Hellyer, My Life and Views on Canada, the U.S., the World, and the Universe. So good evening, Paul Hellyer.
Hello, Grant. How are you?
Just fantastic. It's an honor to have a chance to interview you and to get your latest book. How many books have you done now?
This is the 15th and final one.
Wow, 15. My goodness.
Yeah.
Are you sure it's your last one?
Pardon me?
You sure it's your last one?
The last three, I said it was the last. but I really think this one is going to be.
Wow. So can you tell me a little bit about your book? What were you trying to get across to the world in this final book of yours?
Well, actually, Grant, it's a little different than the previous two. The previous two and the last one are really a trinity. They're all connected in a sense. The one 2 books ago, published about 8 years ago, entitled Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, was really a book on disclosure and covering a lot of subjects that people ordinarily don't talk about, and many of them are unfamiliar with. So it was a sort of a disclosure book and touched on some pretty important subjects. Well, then I thought that was going to be my last. Well, then after that, I got a lot of information as to what was really going on in the world and in the United States in particular, and some of the connections between what happened in World War II and what was happening since that had not been talked about or publicized in any particular way. And so I said that this information is far too important just to be left lying. It has to be made public, and I have a responsibility to write another book and try and get it out so that there will be more people, especially in the United States, but also around the world, who know what has been happening and what is more likely to happen in the years ahead. So that was number 2 of the trilogy, and then the third one, this one, is a little different because it starts out with 15 chapters on my early life and my political career right through until 2005 or 2004 when I retired from active partisan life. And the next 10 chapters are disclosure chapters, the first 5 of those on the subjects that we normally talk about. UFOs, where they come from, who the species are, what they're up to, and all that sort of thing. And then the final chapters are new, and they go into subjects as interesting, in my opinion, as the origin of the cosmos, and then what the so-called cabal has up its sleeve for us, what it really plans with its New World Order, which is a New World Order, all right, but it's not a New World Order that is the kind of solution to the world's problems that most people think is good, the kind of world of peace and cooperation and justice and all of these things. It's designed to be a totalitarian world government created by and for the benefit of the elite groups who have been running the United States and much of the world for most of the last 70 years. So that is a part of it that's important, and I point out that these things are related in the sense that what is going on is also, whether we like it or not, a struggle between good and evil, between the light and the dark, and we have to spread the light and give it more prominence, and also try and persuade some of the people on the dark side to switch sides and help save the planet from a kind of future that no one would really want to see for it except the perpetrators. So there are a lot of things in there that are new and quite important in my opinion. I think it's the most important book I've ever written, even though a lot of it is not new stuff. But the last 5 chapters are pretty powerful chapters, and I'm hoping I can get it out and have a lot of people read it.
Well, it's really important, Paul. I think that we put a context in what you've written, and I think from what I've reviewed from your book, you deal with. I don't want to say political necessarily, but I think your perspective has become very sociological because you deal with things like military spending, secrecy, weather alteration, the cabal, secrecy, and a review of Elena's book, Elena Freeland's book, in terms of alteration of weather. You've somehow kind of packaged all of this book in a sociological kind of perspective. What was your intent there?
Well, my intent was to try to alert the people of the United States that they have to take back control of their country, which they haven't had for the last 70 years. And if they don't take back control of it and don't take it back now, that they're in for trouble unlike they have ever seen or that they can probably imagine. That's the point. And it is so little talked about and so little written about that I felt obliged to say what I thought was the truth. I believe it to be the truth that the United States has been taken over by a group that I call the cabal, and that cabal is under the influence of remnant of the Nazi Party from the 1930s and 40s, and also perhaps may have an ally in with one of the species of what we call the aliens, although in this case they probably wouldn't like that that designation because some of them have been on the planet for a long time. But people have no idea that this is the case. They have no idea what is going on. There isn't more than one or two people in 100 that I talk to that you could really say has a grip on, a handle on what has been happening for so long and what has transpired to change the United States into basically, a state that is under the control of the military and the police, and that this is a situation that, if it continues, is going to be very, very bad news for first the United States, or maybe first Russia, you never know, and then for much of the rest of the world. And sure, it's going to be a tough sell, but it's got to start somewhere. And I'm hoping that my latest book, Hope Restored, will spark, light a few sparks or candles or whatever you want to call it to get people interested and to spread the word. Because this is not a problem that can be solved from the top down, because the top is all compromised. It's in most of it, the most power at the top is part of the problem. And so millions, and I say millions, many millions, of ordinary Americans have first got to educate themselves and acquaint themselves with the facts and what's going on, and then to say to the Congress and the President, we want a certain number of things done which will prevent this final takeover of our country from happening. And we want them done now, because if we don't have them done now, there's a very real possibility that it will be too late. So I was hoping actually to get the book out a little sooner so that they could have a little bit of a first round before the midterm elections. But that didn't happen, so now I'm going to have to rewrite the final chapter, 25, and put it in the context of the new Congress picking up the flag and doing the things that have to be done, and getting the people worked up, hopefully with a Congress that will listen, and the people have to be very blunt about it. They have to say, in effect, you do these things or you're toast at the next election. There's absolutely nothing else that really affects politicians. They don't listen to ordinary suggestions. They don't read very much. They don't read books, and that's one of the problems, of course. And they pay no attention to op-eds and editorials that are often, quite educational. All they pay attention to is what the cabal wants them to do to enhance their power and their military capability and their ability to carry out their plan for world domination. That's what they want. And a lot of it's been happening in the dark because Congress has not known what's been going on for the last few years. And,
now you outlined 6 or 7 major proposals to, short circuit or at least inject some sanity into the dialogue about this whole issue. Like the first example that you cite is shutting down the CIA. And then there's 5 or 6 other issues that you say that that has to come to sort of some sort of fruition to close down to bring some sort of dialogue about all these things.
Those are the things that have to be done to give Congress the chance to review what has actually happened in the last 70 years and to make new plans based on their new knowledge. In other words, it's a tipping point. Either they act
Yeah.
now to start, what's a good word, reducing the emphasis on armaments and the old paradigm of killing each other, which goes back thousands of years, or it will be too late because the capability of each generation of weapons has been getting worse and worse. And you go back in history and you just trace it from the days when they used clubs and so on, and then swords and spears and muskets with their powder loaded from the back, and then other more efficient ones and automatic rifles and all sorts of things, right through to, at the end of World War II, the atomic bomb. Well, since that time, not only are we in the position of having enough atomic weapons in the world, which, if used, and it is a very real possibility that they could be used, would make the planet uninhabitable for the human species. And that is what we do not want to happen. So they have to start immediately moving out of a paradigm which was based on control, pride, and power, and start moving toward the kind of new paradigm based on peace and cooperation and justice.
Yeah. You outline, closing down the NSA and DARPA and the Federal Reserve, and the chemtrails and spacecraft and banning automatic weapons, and you've really come a long way from your initial position. You and I both remember what we did in 2005 at the Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto.
Right.
Can you sort of summarize, your movement from that initial position in 2005 to how you feel about things right now? How far has things come along in those?
So far that I can barely describe it, but part of it was me coming along. Because in 2005 I was in kindergarten on these subjects.
Well, that's
everybody I knew more about it than I did.
Yeah, well, that's my fault, I guess, in a certain way, but that's okay.
But you got me into it, and Mike Bird, and I'm not sorry at all, because I think it was destiny. I think it was meant to be that I would be a messenger of truth, because the governments of this world, including the United States, were not telling the truth about anything of significance. And this goes way back from, to the days of Eisenhower, right on through the people that have died mysteriously, and the extent of their back engineering of the spacecraft, and then the development of new weapons, and all of this stuff has been done under the strictest of secrecy. And you know that the penalties are very severe under the National Security Act, so that if anybody is concerned about it and wants to talk about it, wants to let the public in on it, that the price is just too high. And especially if they're of a reasonable age and have children and so on that they have to keep, because they lose their benefits, they lose their pension, they're subject to heavy fines, and some of them have had some bad accidents and so on. So that all of this development has been going on under a cloak of secrecy, which you can barely imagine. And then when somebody does start saying something, of course, then they have the balance of disinformation and misinformation. I keep getting letters from people, not many of them, but one or two or three, about NASA saying, that we'll find a planet with people on it in 10 or 15 years. Well, this is just a deliberate attempt to mislead public opinion. That's all it is, because they've known for years and years and years about the visitors from other planets and other star systems, and they've been in the loop, and they're just lying, that's all. And it's hard when they put out stuff that gives the impression that that we're 50 or 100 years behind where we actually are, for people to accept that the truthers, as I call myself and others, are right, and that NASA and other government information sources are wrong. So that's just part of the problem. But it's a very important part, because when they put out something, it gets a lot of media attention. I have a friend in Winnipeg, Manitoba, would you believe, who sent me 2 or 3 very large articles from NASA, sort of wondering what I think about them. And what I think about them isn't fit to print, let alone to say, because I have a zero tolerance, really, for such deliberate misleading of the people on such important matters. And so over this period of time, I have moved from the point where kindergarten was probably applicable through grades 2, 3, 4, 5, and maybe even 5 or 6 or 7 now, in the sense that I think my knowledge and understanding, which is probably even more important, of the situation has come a long, long way, and especially in the last 4 years, I would say 4 or 5 years. And the second last book that I wrote, as you know, was the Money Mafia, World in Crisis. Well, I go into chapter and verse on that. I say that as far back as 1940, the Council on Foreign Relations knew or thought that the Germans were going to lose the war, and so they decided to start planning for a new empire that would encompass all of the land that Hitler coveted, plus a lot more, all of North America and much of Asia. And that was in 1940. And then not too long after that, there were people in the German hierarchy, the Nazi hierarchy, who realized that they were, after the Russians and the Americans came into the war, that they couldn't win. And so they should plan for that eventuality and then surrender and go underground. And that's exactly what they did. Before they surrendered, they started building a new headquarters in Antarctica and sending some of their best engineers and scientists down there with all of the backup necessary to establish what would normally be called a government in waiting, a new headquarters. And it must have been a pretty powerful place, because Admiral Byrd knew, the Allies knew that something was going on down there, and Admiral Byrd went down with a flotilla and tried to take over, and was driven back by flying saucers coming out of the water. And I think it sank one of the ships and killed some men, and so they had to give up and turn around and come back. And I don't know of anybody who has said that since that situation has changed, that it has gone away. And I suspect that it's still there. I asked the question in one of my earlier books about asking the question and getting an answer. But of course, no one has ever said boo about it. And the problem is that by the time Byrd got back to the United States, and he was allegedly, I think it was Lynn Caston or somebody said that he was saying that they should use the thermonuclear bombs on Antarctica. But by that time, the Nazi influence from major operation, which you're familiar with, Operation Paperclip,
Right. Yeah.
Was such that the shadow government, or government in waiting, or alternate government, as it's called in the United States, had sufficient power that they wouldn't, that they just ignored it, and that was, I think, a turning point. But of course, a lot of people are really not too familiar with these things. Operation Paperclip is in, you can Google that and get the information about it. When the war was over, the United States recruited hundreds of Nazi scientists. And President Truman approved, but on the condition they weren't, Nazis in the sense of being hardcore partisans. But then the military, and I've gone through something like this myself, the military paid no attention to it. And so they got a lot of these people in, and not just the rocket scientists, but they got some people too that had previous experience with flying saucers, because allegedly they had been working on them for some time, and they got in on the business of back engineering the vehicle that crashed, one of the vehicles that crashed at Roswell, right from the beginning. And they're probably responsible for moving it to the western United States and establishing the headquarters in Nevada, which has became so secretive and so on for so long. So I have delved into these things and tried to find out who's on first. And in my second last book, in the Money Mafia, I quote from somebody who looked at another aspect of these things, and that was the money. And he said that the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland had Nazi connections, and it helped the Nazis both before and during the war. And after the war, there were people who wanted to wipe it out, but the Nazis had enough underground support that didn't happen. And today, they're running the world as far as money is concerned. They're setting the rules that we use here in Canada, for example, instead of the ones that we had earlier, during and after the war, which made sense, as against the ones we have now, which make no sense. So that's the reason that when you come back to that list that you mentioned, Victor, that I say that the Federal Reserve System is number two and sort of equal with the CIA in having to be taken over. And there have been some little talks about its power and not doing the things that the president would like to have it do, but its time is up, and it should have been up long ago, because in one of my books I call the establishment of the Federal Reserve System the biggest heists in history. Just imagine a country taking its right to create its own money and handing it over lock, stock, and barrel to five of the most important and wealthiest bankers in the world. Can you think of anything sillier than that?
Well, the question arises to me is that in the general understanding of the population as to how things work, why don't people realize what you're saying, Paul? I mean, I just don't understand. It seems so obvious to you and I, and to the people that we listen to. Why don't the general public get this, what you're describing? I just don't understand it.
Well, I'll tell you the main reason is the popular press. There's a lady in the United States, Ellen Hodgson Brown, who is one of the best people who understand money and banking in the world. She's, in the top echelon.
Sure.
And she wrote a book called The Web of Debt. I don't know if you've ever read it or not. But the first 100 pages are just absolutely illuminating. You don't have to read the whole book, just to read the first 100 pages. And she says that after the banking cartel, after Jekyll Island, where this plot was really put together, and after Congress approved the legislation just before Christmas, they probably had Fairy Plum something relating to Christmas on their minds, rather than what they should have been thinking about. They went out, and 2 or 3 organizations set up a committee to determine the 25 most influential newspapers in the United States. And they made a list, and then they bought editorial control of all of those 25 papers. That's why. Because the news doesn't get out. I have written op-eds and sent them to newspapers, and they just say thanks but no thanks.
Right. Yeah.
And it's so obvious if you stop to look at it. It's so obvious. Why would we, the people, hand over to a handful of people the right to create our money, create it all as debt, and then lend it to us, and we have to pay it back with interest, even though there's no money to pay it back with? It's mathematically and socially absurd.
It's like leaning into a right hook. It just doesn't make any sense.
It's so, well, I was going to use that word stupid, but it's so bad that you can hardly believe it. And people's eyes start to roll if you start talking to them about it, because they say, well, surely the experts know what they're doing. Well, the experts are the ones that have taken us to the cleaners. And it's a few poor Joes from farmers from around the world, and engineers. Engineers are pretty good at looking through this sort of stuff too, who've been fighting this battle for 100 years or more, probably I don't know how long, but a long time, and have never quite made it because the dice are loaded against you. And the Federal Reserve Board, a couple of years ago, spent $38 million, and I think the following year $40 million, according to Ellen Brown. I was going to use the word buying, but maybe we can think of a nicer word. They spent that much money engaging economists, including the publishers of economic magazines, to write articles for them. And did you ever think of a nicer way of getting those people shut up from telling the truth than to hire them for fairly good retainers?
Right.
So that they're really beholden to their employers. And this has been going. Imagine $38 or $40 million just from the reserve system to capture the opinion makers, basically. Well, then you have to assume that the cabal has done exactly the same thing. and that there are certain subjects that just don't get in the mainline press. And the one that the three of us are interested in, or have been interested in most, is on their list, because it's very difficult to write an article about what's been happening in these fields and send it to a paper and have them publish it.
Do you sense? Yeah. Do you sense that this whole, in the context of what you're talking about, do you sense that the whole question of the frame it how you want, the extraterrestrial presence, and all of the things that you've been talking about over the last few minutes, how do these two things coalesce into a reality that makes sense to anyone who's listening? I mean, you've described the economic conditions and monetary issues, and then you juxtapose all of that with the so-called extraterrestrial presence. How do these two things coalesce into a meaningful context for people that want to understand, what our reality is all about?
Well, that's a good question, but basically, it is the cabal's successful effort to control the world. And what do they need? They need control over the money supply, and they have it. Some people don't even know what you're talking about. If you're talking about the cabal, it starts at the top with the Bavarian Illuminati and the Yule Society, and then goes into the Three Sisters, I call them, the Bilderbergers, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission.
Right.
And then you're associated with the banking cartel, which is the most powerful one, and it's related to these people, and they control the money supply of the world, and they can decide who's going to do what, to the extent. Well, I'll come back to that maybe. Then the next layer is the oil cartel, and it's to a very large extent controlled by the banking cartel. So when you talk about control over global warming and changing from an oil economy to a clean energy economy, they're the ones that are standing in the way. They're the ones that own the patents of something that 98% of the people just don't connect with at all, which is zero-point energy. They've never heard of it. They hear about windmills and tidal waves and solar panels and all this sort of stuff. Some of it harmful and a lot of it grotesque. And they don't hear of the one thing that would stop the planet from overheating and save it for humanity for generations to come, which is controlled by the cabal and by the oil cartel, because the technology has existed for a long, long time. Michael Wolff, who, as you know, it's a pseudonym, but he, in a radio broadcast years ago, after he had been working in Nevada, and I think it was S4 for a long time, said that the United States, in cooperation with the extraterrestrials, and here's the connections, with the extraterrestrials had come to workable solutions of both cold fusion and zero-point energy. Now, that was decades ago, and all of this stuff could have been put into effect before we started getting these terrible storms that we've been getting recently, and that are going to get worse and worse as the years go by.
Yep.
But it's power, and it's misdirected power. Well, then below that is the transnational corporations, again pretty well controlled by the banking cartel, and then the intelligence groups, the CIA, the Fed, the FBI to a certain extent, not so much, and then the NSA totally, and including some foreign groups like the MI6 and the Israeli Mossad, and then finally a huge chunk of the U.S. military. And they're all connected, and they have all coalesced in this amorphous cabal, which is out to establish this new world order, which is in fact a fascist government. And so there is a connection, because it's the alien technology which is being used by the troops who have just worked wonders in the 70 years since they started working on it, to the point where they have, a powerful group of anti-gravity ships that they could use to do what Stephen Greer sometimes talks about as a false flag operation. But this wouldn't be false flag in the sense that they would be out for results. They would be out to scare the people of the world to the point where they would just give up and accept what was going to happen to them. And they have all of these things: the money group, the oil group, the armed forces, the intelligence group, have all been working with alien technology, and in many cases with aliens actually involved in the operations. So they're all connected, and we're just sort of beginning to catch up, or we have been beginning to catch up for the last 50 years to an amazing extent with the technology of the visitors. I don't think we've reached it yet, but we have moved so far in my lifetime that I could take a long time to describe how far we've come. I was just thinking, I think it was today or yesterday, about my first election campaign that you mentioned, Grant, and I was using blotters and matches because everybody smoked, and blotters because people were still using ink to write, and this sort of thing, during my election campaign. Well, when you mention those things today, and the young people don't even know what you're talking about. Yeah. So that's how much we've come along, and it's really fantastic with our smartphones. But I have great fear of the smartphones, because I know that every bit of information can go right back to headquarters. And the reason that I recommend, Victor, and that list that you've more or less read off, that the NSA be shut down totally, not forever, but temporarily, so that the balance of power would change. So if the U.S. government took over the Fed, then the money power would begin to disappear, They wouldn't be able to finance what they're doing. And if they got rid of the CIA, would have it just wouldn't have the center of evil going around the world with their plans of perpetual war and all that sort of thing that they have been promoting in order to justify these huge military expenditures. And and we've all quoted this from Carol Rosin, who talking to von Braun in his mellow years when he thought he was going to die, said they have to have an enemy. And and he said first it'll be the communists, which it was, and then it will be the terrorists. But when they didn't have the terrorists, they created them. And so they had pulled off this 9/11 stunt, to give them the excuse to start bombing Baghdad, and overnight a handful of terrorists became thousands of them, and they changed the whole complexion of the world geopolitics. And then finally he said it will be the extraterrestrials, and they would give the impression to the people that they were being taken over by someone from afar, and they should bow their knee to whoever it was that was trying to save them and fight for them. So the plan is an old one, and I think what worries me is that it's being carried out so far just about exactly as it was originally drawn up, and that's the scary part. So getting back to the list, what I'm saying is there are certain things that can be done. DARPA, for example, should be shut down, because if you read Alana Freeland's latest book, you will see some of the things that are being done which are so awful that they're almost indescribable. And the public hasn't a clue, and the Congress hasn't a clue, and most of the people running the press haven't a clue. So I'm recommending in something out of YouTube that I made recently that everybody should read that if they want to really pretend that they know what's going on in the world. Because if they don't know. And it's pretty scary stuff. But to come back to the sort of the bottom line, I named my book Hope Restored because it is possible. If millions of Americans really said enough is enough, and we're going to take these steps and find out what's going on and then make sensible decisions in order to recover the control of our country, it's possible. In which case, hope would be restored. If nothing is done, well, you know the answer.
It's a pretty simple response, isn't it? Yeah. Do you sense that the direction that we're going in with respect to a general understanding within, the general public of the understanding of what's going on, what mechanisms, what platforms of understanding are out there that will allow the general public to understand what you're saying?
Well, I think it's mostly the social press. I don't think there's much hope with the other press because it's all controlled. I've read what was the name of the guy that wrote the true story of the Bilderbergers? Daniel Esterlin.
Right. Yeah. Daniel. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In his latest book, he has, I think, about 6 pages listing every single ownership of the English language press, both written and electronic, in the world, and every case it is either owned by or controlled by a Bilderberger. So that's what you're up against.
Okay.
So you get down to the mundane things of using emails and Facebook and things that blogs that influence a few people, but they have power now. And the young people, and you mentioned the automatic weapons. I put in the 7th one, the automatic weapons, not as being absolutely essential to the arresting the power for now, but as a demonstration to the young people of America that they count. Because what they did after a couple of shootings a year ago was so dramatic and so encouraging, them standing up and saying to the politicians that we've had enough. And that is exactly what you have to do in a case like this. And it was a demonstration of what the social media can do, that they could could get so many young people involved so quickly within, a very short period of time. Well, that is precisely what has to happen to change the situation in the country and to arrest the present trend and to restore hope. That is the spirit that has to be developed, and that is the kind of action that has to happen. And it can be done. It's not impossible. The odds are not great, but I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning if I wasn't an optimist. So
Yeah.
I keep fighting away, even though I'm getting a little older sometimes. And I think that as long as there's hope, you have to keep working. And there are more people. There are more people that understand now than there were. Victor, you know that.
Well, of course, yeah. When we first began this journey, Paul, and even before that, the understanding of this whole issue in terms of the cosmic presence of whoever these beings are, it's been going on for a long, long time. We've really come a long way in bringing forward the understanding that we're not alone in the cosmos, and who and how can we recognize that and allow that recognition to become part of the human condition, so that the human family understands that there is light, as you said in your previous book, at the end of the tunnel. And it really kind of confounds me in a lot of ways why people dismiss investigating or thinking about or delving into the whole idea that this extraterrestrial presence is so prominent in our society, but it's denied and unacknowledged to a point where it becomes, in the face of the news cycle, a non-entity. And I just, for some reason, I just don't understand how that understanding can be denied. It completely confounds me.
But it's coming. It's coming. Demographics, I think, are playing a part, because there are more whistleblowers now, as you know, and that's because the people who have been involved for decades are reaching retirement age when they don't care so much. And so they're beginning to go public, and to an extent that I hadn't seen 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Paul, I have a question for you in terms of, you mentioned earlier the midterm elections. It's sort of a two-part question. Are elections an effective way anymore of trying to resolve what's going on? And if we had, like, people listening to you, you might have, say, somebody that you awaken today who listens to you and becomes like, they suddenly decide, I've got to do something, and they would say, well, I've just got my one little vote. What would you suggest to somebody, say, in the United States who hears your message today and decides, I want to do something? What would you advise them to do?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that Canadians should get involved in American elections. Even though the CIA has been involved in elections all over the world for years and years and years, including a Canadian election that I know of because I was involved in it. I think one should be very careful about that. But in my book, I advise the people, and it would have had some effect, a little effect, maybe if we'd been a little faster on the mark, to get in touch with their representative, regardless of party. Because these things are not partisan issues. These are people issues. These are matters of survival. But they get in touch with their representative and say, you do these things that have to be done, and cite the list. And if you don't, at some stage you're going to be toast. And we're going to work hard to make sure that happens. That is the operative thing. Now, the second part of your question is related to the UFOs.
Yeah, just just the idea, like if a lot of people sort of feel sort of like they're powerless, that they really can't do anything. I just was, trying to see what you would advise them how to. And you mentioned the fact that you'd go to your representative. Is there anything that Canadians can do in terms of influencing our government to help out?
I don't think that would be kosher. I don't think we should start meddling in their business.
No, in Canadian, in the Canadian government, I'm saying, like as a Canadian, is there anything a Canadian can do?
Oh, that's what I'm saying. That we shouldn't expect the Canadian government to be expressing opinions about the American political.
No, but I mean about the UFO issue, not the political thing, but in terms of the UFO issue, is there anything the Canadian government or the Canadian people can do to sort of get some sort of enlightenment on the UFO issue, or move the issue along, or anything like that?
Well, I think we have to enlighten our own people before we expect to have as much influence as we would like to have south of the border.
Yeah.
Where our people are just as in the dark as the Americans. I would say 50-50. It's an uphill battle all the way along, but every inch of progress you make gets you 1 inch closer to the goal. And I don't think that elections are going to be won or lost on that issue, the UFO issue. I think there are other issues that are much more in the public mind than those at the present time.
You've been around a long time. I'm kind of interested when you mentioned your idea about the origin of the cosmos. Can you maybe say a few words about that? What you came to conclusion of?
Yes, I introduced the subject by something that is new to most people, and that's remote viewing. Some people know about it, but I have a whole chapter in the book about it, so that people would understand where it was coming from. And then I related a story of a remote view of what happened. And what happened was that God caused the cosmos to be created with the Big Bang. And that's where it began. So God existed before the Big Bang and decided to, in effect, blow himself up. And this started the creation of everything we have today, everywhere, including all of us. And the particles that emanated from that Big Bang went out, and they, over a period of thousands and thousands of years, were responsible for creating the suns and the moons and the planets and the people and the mountains and the valleys and the animals and the water, which we need for life, and the trees and the sunsets and the sunrises and all of these things. They're all emanate from the same source. And, there are a lot of people that say that God is dead. Well, what I'm saying is far from that is not the case. He is alive, very much, and he is everywhere. And I explain with universal consciousness that it's possible for anyone to make contact with the Creator. And in effect, that the Creator, and I use the masculine in my book, although I explained at the beginning that that's only for convenience's sake, because I don't think that is correct. I think that the Creator, God, is the father and mother of us all, and he likes all of us because we're all his children, and it doesn't matter whether we're white or red or yellow or black or what we are, and to an extent whether we're good or bad, because we're still his children. But I think we have to listen more to the kind of world that he would like to see, or they would like to see, and instead of a world based on power and greed and hate. And the opposite, of course, is that the love is the glue that holds the cosmos together, and the only solution that there is that we abandon this sense that we've had for thousands of years and start controlling our sort of natural instinct to want to fight and gain superiority and be number one, and be more concerned with other people and their needs, and share our abilities and our wealth and so on with them.
Wonderful. Is there anything else you want to add, Victor? Have you got anything else you want to?
No, actually, just the whole idea of the larger context, I guess, of what we're talking about with respect to our place in the cosmos. I know Paul and I have discussed this a lot, and in terms of where we fit with respect to these civilizations that are beyond the planet, and how they perceive us. On an ending note, in your estimation, Paul, these civilizations, these beings, whoever they might be, and how they perceive who we are and what we are and where we're going, do you see them having any kind of impact overtly or implicitly or whatever into how the next level of generation of understanding of who we are as a species, do you see them having any kind of impact on where we're going with our own species because of their presence here?
Absolutely.
How do you see that?
Most of them perceive us as primitive,
mm-hmm.
and we are. Most of the species are much more spiritual than we are,
mm-hmm.
and so that they're interested in spiritual things, and they think we're, just. And most of them are concerned about the way we treat this planet, which was created for us, and which is one of the beautiful planets, and is coveted by, I'm sure, a lot of people, a lot of species, and they are working through individuals to try and get a greater understanding. I have a friend, a very close friend, who has written a book, which was dictated by one of the species, and it's a very interesting and a very illuminating book. And this sort of thing has been going on going back to the days of the Space Brothers, and so there is input from other systems which are more advanced both spiritually and technologically. There's no question about that. But the problem is that there may be one or two species that are not benign, and they may still have designs on the kind of development that is
right, exactly, yeah,
in our best interests.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah. So it's pretty much an open book in terms of how the complexities of these off-world civilizations, as complex as they might be, in terms of the benefit towards our planet and any kind of deleterious effects that they may have on our own planet. It's almost like we're sort of in the middle of a transition of understanding of who's in control of what, and how these ET civilizations perceive us as a civilization. I mean, you have to sense that whoever these beings are, Earth is not the only place they've been to experience this level of civilization that we have. They must have encountered similar civilizations to us and dealt with us or them on the terms of the almost primordial or primitive existence that we have. So they must have an understanding of how to deal with us and how they
may have gone through the same thing themselves at some stage.
Exactly,
earlier on, because we're maybe one of the later ones to come along.
Exactly. Or others similar to us. There must be other planets similar to us that have gone through this whole transition of understanding our place in the cosmos and how we deal with these sentient or enlightened civilizations who say we've pretty much got it all under control, or at least we've eliminated the possibility of our own extinction. So how are they helping us to become a civilization that will eventually understand that we do not have to extinct ourselves in order to become, a plausible civilization within the cosmos? And that's where we're headed. I mean, everything.
I'm not convinced that we have guaranteed that we're not going to end our civilization, because I think it's happened before and it could happen again. And this is one of the reasons that they've been taking such a keen interest since 1947 and 1945, that we have these nuclear weapons, and now even worse, with which we could wipe out our species. And all we need, and you've seen these clocks showing how close we are to doomsday.
Right.
All we need to do is to have somebody go off the deep end and start something and have it escalate. And that is the reason that they are so concerned with us and with how we handle things in the next few years, because they like this planet. They would like to see it preserved, either for us or for somebody else. And they don't want to see it wrecked, as apparently was the case with Mars when it got involved in the nuclear war. And so there's a very keen interest, and I think one of the things that Alana's book says that worries me is that we are building fences to prevent them from coming to help us or to be close to us, because if they do now, we have the technology to destroy the ships as they come into our environment, and this is something that I think is both new and alarming.
Well, your voice has been heard since 2005, when you said and did what you did at Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto, and I think that your voice will resonate for decades in terms of how we understand what this issue is all about. And personally, I want to thank you for standing forward on this whole issue in the way that you initially did not want to accept it. And I understand that was part of the whole thing.
I have to bow to you two, because you've both been the pioneers in the business, and I'm a Johnny-come-lately, but I'm just trying to do what I can. And if we work together, I think I still believe in miracles.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's great.
That's what we need.
For sure.
Beautiful. Wonderful. Thank you, Paul, for your input and your wisdom. And we'll stay optimistic, and we'll continue to work.
Very good. All the best to you both.
Thank you, and thank you, Victor, for helping me out here, and thank you for bringing Paul onto the scene. It wouldn't have happened without you.
Well, it's been a great honor to be part of this whole process.
Beautiful. Okay, good night, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Good night. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.